Well, welcome everyone to the Association for Social Economics webinar podcast series. Throughout the series, we will explore the profound and multifaceted impact of economics. This podcast series is sponsored by the ASE, whose mission is to foster research and publication centered on the reciprocal relationship between economics and the broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy. Each month, I get a chance to sit down and interview scholars in the field. I am your host, Iris Booter, and with me today I have Dr. Zoe Sherman. Dr. Sherman is a political economist and economic historian with a research focus on the entanglements of communications with capital accumulation. She is an associate professor of economics at Merrimack College, a co-editor of Rethinking Marxism, and a member of the Dollars and Cents editorial collective. She lived out her childhood in the Bronx, New York, and her adulthood thus far in Boston, Massachusetts. So thank you so much, Zoe, for being here with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So can you tell us a little more about yourself, your background, and really what motivated you to get into the field of economics?
Sure. I took a very meandering path to get to economics. So as an undergraduate, could go further back, I suppose, but we can start with my sort of formal academic training. As an undergraduate, I did not study any economics. I didn't really know what it was, and had the child confronted with a strange vegetable kind of reaction, like not sure what it is, pretty sure I don't like it. So I didn't study any then. My majors were music and math. But that was in the context of a very strong interdisciplinary core curriculum and many humanities electives and one sociology class, so I got a little taste of social science. Then after my undergraduate education, I took a complete turn. I moved to Boston initially to go to the North Bennett Street School, which is the oldest trade school in the country, and I learned how to be a piano tuner. And that's what I did for most of my 20s. But after a few years, I found I really missed the classroom. And so I went to UMass Boston to the master's program in American Studies because I liked the interdisciplinarity of it, and I had a great time there. And while I was following the American Studies curriculum, it started to occur to me that economics was important. So I wanted to understand questions of power, and economics was very much tied up with that. So my American Studies professor sent me down the hall to talk with economics faculty. I started taking classes with Randy Albelda and Arthur McEwen and others in the UMass Boston department at that time. And I got hooked, I guess. I decided I needed to know more. So I then went on to the PhD program at UMass Amherst.
Very interesting. I think, yeah, a lot of times we have the meandering path to econ for sure. I remember being in high school and taking a econ class and thinking econ was just about money, honestly, because you just didn't know, right? And so, yes, I had a very, different path, but similar meandering path to that. So you have served as a trustee for the ASE. And so can you tell us how you got involved with the ASE and what the role of a trustee is?
Sure. I initially got involved with the association through the summer school. Our next one is coming up this summer, but the last one was, I think that was 2015 at Brock University. So I attended the summer school, and so I got to meet some of the people who were involved in leadership positions at that time. Ellen Mutari and Deb Figart were there. And so as I got to know them through the summer school, they encouraged me to be more involved in the ASE and to run for trustee. Mm-hmm. The trustees are part of the governing body for the association. So we have collective oversight of association activities, and then there's the opportunity to take on some specific tasks, join ad hoc committees for specific things that the association is working on. Not directly related to my role as a trustee, but I also would like to comment about my experience early in my ASE history. I applied for a William Waters research grant, and I requested the money to pay for summer camp for my daughter so that I would have more writing time. And there may be grant committees that would not take that seriously, but the ASE is serious enough about the social values that that was respected as a reason to request the funding. And currently I'm on the planning committee. I'm no longer a trustee, my term ended, but I'm currently on the planning committee for the 2024 World Congress and Summer School coming up in June.
I'm like fascinated the fact that they and like applaud them for taking that seriously about, you know, the summertime and needing to fund that. That's amazing. I had no idea that they would do that. So that's great. So in studying economic history through a social economic lens, how do you analyze the role of institutions and social structures in shaping economic outcomes?
Well, I'm interested in how groups of people both navigate within the institutions and social structures that they find, and also struggle over the architecture of those institutions and social structures. So the institutionalists persuaded me, right, that the constraints that institutions put on certain actors and actions are inseparable from the coordination and the capacity expansion that they facilitate. So that means that those who are committed to goals that are more thwarted than they are aided by the existing structures are going to want to change the structure itself. The structure, at some points, it's less contended and people sort of work within it, and at some points the structure itself becomes a point of intense conflict. So sometimes people who are not able to do what they want within the structure can build the power to make those changes, and sometimes they can't. With my cultural studies background, with my education in American studies, I tended at first to focus on communication and representations, norms, and ideas, and I definitely still keep that lens. Whose interpretation of reality becomes the kind of common sense of the community. I think that's important to think about, whose values and norms govern behavior. My dissertation advisor, Jerry Friedman, then also encouraged me and reminded me to pay attention to the state, right? When and how do groups seek to harness the authority of the state to support their aims, and when and how do they succeed or fail? So now I usually remember to do that too.
That's fascinating. That is great. So in your opinion, what role does interdisciplinary collaboration play in enriching the perspectives and frameworks within social economics compared to maybe mainstream neoclassical economics?
My training as an undergraduate and as a master's degree student was so interdisciplinary that I tend to start with the topic, right? There's the phenomenon that I'm interested in, and then I take up whatever analytical tools I can find that will say something about that topic. And sometimes I'm not even super aware of the disciplinary boundaries, which has its weaknesses. Sometimes I am not as aware as I should be of the fuller disciplinary context of the tool that I happen to find. So that's something I have to be careful of. But it also has its strengths, I think, leading with the topic and then being open to many different disciplinary tools. So that's important to me. Political economists in the 18th and 19th centuries, as the field was taking shape, and then neoclassical economists in the 20th century defined the boundaries of their disciplines by excluding certain questions from consideration. That's how they defined what their field of study was. So the language of the discipline makes some things all but unsayable. And there are things that are difficult or impossible to say inside the walled garden of economics, sort of narrowly construed, that I want to be able to talk about. I want to be able to talk about the social construction of race and gender. I want to be able to talk about collective action. I want to be able to talk about the use of political means to pursue economic ends and vice versa. And I think we can understand more about the economy as we live in it by asking those questions than by foreclosing them. And to do that, we really need interdisciplinary collaboration.
Absolutely. And so speaking of, how do you think educational institutions could adapt their economics curricula to really incorporate both social and neoclassical perspectives, so to provide students with a more comprehensive understanding of economic theories?
Well, I certainly think the curriculum should be pluralist, and that we should, as faculty, take responsibility for teaching theories that we find persuasive, but also theories that we don't find persuasive. And I think every theory is a valiant attempt to understand something, and none of them ever succeeds completely. The world is never knowable in total. So whichever theory we're wrangling with on a given day, I think the most honest way we can present it to students is just one of many provisional and valiant attempts. And I think this way we can help our students understand something about the economic world we live in, something about each of the economic theories that we include in the curriculum, but also something about the activity of theorizing itself, a certain degree of intellectual humility, perhaps.
Absolutely. And so we're going to turn our attention now to your research, which is vast and very interesting. So can you elaborate on the genesis of your research arc on the creation of the audience attention commodity in the US, and what inspires you to delve into the historical roots of the attention economy, and particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
Sure. I have a sort of fascination with advertising. To a large extent, it's probably a fascination of the horrible, because the way that advertising uses language is so different from the primary way that I use language. I tend to use language. I think of language's primary purpose as tools for expressing ideas with as much care and honesty and precision as I can manage, and allowing for acknowledgement of uncertainty, self-interrogation about my own thought processes. It's the kind of way that I use language. And that's not how language is used in advertising. Of course, promotional language is a very different way of using language. So what first caught my attention was the idea of crafting sales messages as a job and what that means for authorship. Right? I read a bunch of advertising industry memoirs, and the practitioners who wrote about the work that they did in advertising, they certainly wrote about things that they enjoyed, creative challenges that it was exciting to meet. But I also kept finding accounts of ethical worries. Right? The job requires promoting a product, whether or not you think it's any good for the customers, for the world. Right? There's this alienation from the authorship, and then you're not recognized as the author. Right? It has to be this kind of corporate speech. So I got kind of intrigued by the weirdness of speech for hire, and I was curious about the historical origin story of that kind of work. And then I discovered that Pamela Walker Laird already wrote that book. It's a really good book. So in her book Advertising Progress, she talks about the development of advertising, the creative production of advertising content as a specialized profession and how that happened. So she'd answered the question that I was curious about to my satisfaction, but as I was discovering that, I realized that there was a different, still unsolved historical origins mystery. Crafting a message is one thing, but getting it in front of the people that you want to reach is a different thing. And there's a lot of awareness now of the internet as an attention economy. And there was scholarship as far back as the 1970s arguing that the mass media's primary product is audience attention. But it wasn't clear to me when and how audience attention came to be a commodity and how it came to be traded in an integrated market in a kind of rationalized way. And I really wanted to know. So that became my first book project.
Wow. That's really interesting. From a much lesser degree, I just find it fascinating with advertising in general, because when I moved from Germany to US, I think the first time I turned on TV, I was like, wait, how does advertising work in the US? It's so different. Like you can even like showcase like other comparison products, which I don't know, maybe things have changed by now in Germany, but you couldn't do that in Germany. So it's just, so to me, it's very intriguing how different advertising works in different countries, right? In order to grab the attention of the different consumers, or like even the prescription drug world, right? It's just that type of advertising is just, it's also so different, right? And then on the bottom, you hear all the little side effects, or not little, all the side effects of it, right? That last forever. I don't know. It's just always fascinating to me how it works in different countries as well. So,
Yes. Yeah. One of the ad industry memoirs where someone raised those kind of ethical concerns, the author used that pharmaceutical advertising example. And he said, what if we were required to be just as vivid about the horrific side
Yes.
effects as we are
Yeah.
about intended effect?
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm like, yeah, that those little side effects, right? They just like blurred out, like, no, those are not little. Those are like lengthy and and
Yeah.
like really important. So yeah, so that's really interesting. You also have a book titled Modern Advertising and the Market for Audience Attention, which was published in 2020. So could you provide us with an overview of your key insights and findings from your research in that book and highlighting really how the historical perspective contributes to understanding the contemporary attention economy?
Sure. So I was motivated by this question. When did audience attention become a commodity? How did that happen? Obviously, our attention is not intrinsically a commodity, right? There has to be a social, historical, economic process of creating the conditions for it to be treated as a commodity. And I looked at the US case because that's what I have training in, US history. Um, so I did some digging, and what I found is that the critical period was basically roughly 1870 to 1920. So during that period, a market for audience attention in the US took shape. And what I mean by that is that there were mechanisms that developed during that time for advertisers to purchase access to the audiences they wanted to reach in a standardized way so that they had a fairly high degree of confidence that they really were going to reach the number of people that they thought they were reaching, that they could get some information about who those people were, they could make some choices about targeting, that the market integrated across geographic distance and across different advertising media. So a national brand could advertise in many places at once in many different media, with a coordinated advertising campaign to really develop their brand identity and deliver their message. So the biggest advertising medium, this is before we have broadcast. So radio comes into being after 1920. So this is before we have broadcast. So the biggest advertising medium of the era, and also the first to modernize, was print, newspapers and magazines. There's an enormous and rapidly growing volume of print media during this period. And it usually accounted for roughly 50% of all advertising expenditures. Everything else was getting the other half, divvying up the other half. So advertisers who wanted to sell their products and publishers who printed their ads had this ongoing conflict over what they owed to one another. Advertisers wanted truthful information about circulation. They wanted to know how many people were going to read this publication and potentially see their ad, and that would determine how much they were willing to pay. Publishers really didn't want to share that information, right? They wanted to be able to dissemble. They might not even know what the destination of their publication was once they printed it and sent it out into the world. So advertising agents played an interesting intermediary role, and their role shifted over this period. So advertising agents started out as sales agents for the newspapers. So they were pushing space in the advertising columns, and their goal was just to get as much revenue for the newspaper as they wanted, and as many commissions for themselves as they could gather, without too much concern for whether it was useful for the advertisers who were buying it. Sometimes advertising agents would even buy the space on their own account and resell it, acting as merchants more than as brokers. But the brokerage was the more common model. But then starting in the late 19th century, advertising agents started to behave more as purchasing agents for the advertisers. Their allegiance flipped, and they took more responsibility for promoting advertisers' interests. And so eventually, in the 1910s, representatives of trade groups representing the advertisers, representing the publishers, representing the ad agents, they hashed out a deal that required independent audits of circulation. There were lots of sketchy things that publishers used to do to try to make it appear that they had more readership than they did. They would print their sample copies on a different weight of paper than the others because the postage was paid by weight, and then they could make it look like they were sending more copies than they really were. It was a real mess. So independent audits were very important to the advertisers, and they got that in that negotiation. so that was a major breakthrough in standardizing print advertising. I also looked at a couple of other media that were important. I looked into outdoor advertising, meaning posters in public places. Bill posting was very haphazard through most of the 19th century. The chaotic nature of bill posting was reflected in this genre of cartoon that I ran across, which has this conventional format. It's called the bill poster's dream. And so it'll show the bill poster with his bucket of paste and his brush sort of falling asleep against the wall that's covered with overlapping posters on all kinds of things. And the comedy of the genre comes from really wacky juxtapositions. You put completely incompatible things next to each other. So advertisers wanting to deliver their message did not find this kind of chaotic display much to their liking. They also couldn't really know if the bill poster ever put their poster anywhere. There were instances of bill posters taking the posters and the payment for putting them up and then dumping them in the river or burning them and just not putting them anywhere. So what happened to modernize bill posting was the construction of billboards, so a dedicated display space that's under the control of the bill poster, and then contracts for guaranteed display periods. And so it was called listed and protected service. The advertiser could check that their posters were where they were promised, that they were maintained for the full term of the contract. They'd know where they were being displayed, and the pricing began to reflect the local population. So that was the price was not related to the cost of hanging the poster. The price was related to how many eyeballs were going to have this within their field of vision. And then the last medium that I really dug into was direct mail marketing, which I found to be the most direct ancestor of modern data mining. Direct mail marketers assembled enormous card files, which was the breakthrough information technology of the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th. And so they would develop these enormous card files with information about recipients of advertising appeals that were sent through the mail. They would track responses. They would add as much information as they could about people and how they reacted to the advertising appeals. So we have these various media, and then the biggest advertising agencies started creating integrated advertising campaigns that used multiple media in a coordinated way. And so that really integrated that audience attention market. There was still some competitive jockeying for position between the bill posters and the publishers and whatnot, but it really did become an integrated market that served advertisers' interests in a much more rational way than the previous iteration.
I mean, this is going to be probably my understatement of the day, but I had zero idea that this was the intricacies of the advertising world. Like, this is fascinating. I had literally no idea about all this background. So, well, thank you for sharing that. And for those, we'll put it in our show notes, but again, that book is Modern Advertising and the Market for Audience Attention. And we'll put that link in our show notes as well for those interested to read more about it. You also do work on free speech rights in relation to capital, class, and commodification, and that really also appears to offer a unique perspective. So could you share some of your preliminary insights or key questions that you are currently grappling with as you outline your next book project?
Sure, yes. In the US, our thinking about free speech is necessarily engaged with the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which was ratified in 1791. So have a long period of wrangling with this. And so what the First Amendment says is not that anyone can say anything in any context. It's not that anyone has a positive right to access the resources and venues that will enable them to speak. It's not that you or I or any other private actor cannot interfere in someone else's attempt to speak. All it says is that Congress may not pass any laws abridging the freedom of speech or religion or assembly or several other rights. So it puts a restraint on Congress, which is now more broadly understood to mean any portion of the state apparatus, right? The state cannot interfere with your speech, according to the First Amendment, although there are many exceptions in practice. But when I thought about what substantively enables us to encounter an audience and speak effectively, or what substantively impedes us from doing so, property and economic resources seemed to be awfully important. Who owns the channels of communication? What are the terms on which we can access them? Who can purchase the services of communications professionals, right? Who can afford to hire someone to speak on their behalf in a using their communications expertise, right? Also, if you sell your labor power to an employer, can your employer govern your speech? It turns out that they can. The First Amendment has nothing to say, offers no protection for you if your employer is censoring you or compelling you to speak against your conscience. That's not something the First Amendment addresses. I was also interested to realize that by the time the First Amendment was ratified, Congress had already passed the first intellectual property laws regarding copyright and patent. And I see intellectual property rights as being in tension with free speech. The holder of an intellectual property right can limit speech that they might hold to be an infringement on their property right. But intellectual property rights were initially constructed and continue to operate in very racialized and gendered and classed ways, treating ideas and expressions generated by members of subordinate racial groups and gender identities and class positions as a resource that can be appropriated, sometimes with compensation, sometimes without. But that apparatus for administering IP law is very ready to recognize dominant groups, whites, men, owners of capital, as legitimate owners of IP, who can then exclude others from its use and capture revenues for themselves from its use. IP is an increasingly important part of capital accumulation strategies for US corporations. So there's a lot of different threads that I'm tugging on, but they're all concerned in various ways with the question of who gets to talk and who gets heard, and how the products of intellect, as much as the products of physical labor, play into the dynamics of capital accumulation.
Right, that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing that new work. And also, before we, ask our standard sign-off questions, I just want to thank you for all your work in planning the World Congress. I'm sure that's a lot of work to do to get that all going, but thank you for your service on that.
Oh, sure. And we'll nod to Harry Constantinides and Lila Davis, who are at our host institution and co-chairing the committee.
Yeah, that's amazing. And regrettably, I have to be at another conference during that time, so I will not be able to join. So, but I encourage all our listeners to attend the World Congress this summer because I'm sure it'll be fascinating. So, as per usual, my standard sign-off questions are: if we want to learn more about you, where can our listeners find you, follow your research, and just read more?
Well, the librarians at the McQuaid Library at Merrimack College do a really lovely job of maintaining the collection of faculty publications. So in the show notes, I'll include the link to the collections on the McQuaid Library website, and you can look for things under my author name. My work with Dollars and Cents, you can find at dollarsandcents.org. And I have a LinkedIn profile. I don't have a lot of my work linked there, but you can figure out how to contact me and be in touch there. We can also put the book link to the book information there.
Yeah, will do. And so I know, heavy question, but I want to end our discussion with looking forward. So what do you envision the future of social economics looks like?
Well, the central challenge that I see, I'll start with the bad news. I think there's good news, but the central challenge that I see is that the institutions and the social structure of higher ed, at least in the US, which is the setting I know best, that's in really rough shape. I don't think we realized how dependent we were on an endless growth model until we stopped growing. And now that enrollments aren't growing anymore, things are getting pretty rough. The spaces for liberal arts teaching and learning, for exploratory research, for thinking, I think they're under threat in many places. In some cases, there are hostile political attacks as a major part of the threat. In other cases, social economists, along with scholars in many other fields, are just trying to make careers in academic institutions whose financial survival is far from certain. We have enormous overcapacity in the US. And so the number of positions and especially the number of secure tenured or tenure track positions is eroding quickly. So to the extent that the intellectual traditions of social economics depend on the kind of transmission that takes place in colleges and universities, we're in some trouble. The proportion of current graduate students who will be able to make academic careers is not large. So the chain of transmission for our intellectual traditions, I think, can't rely on academia as much as we used to. So we will have to do some alternative institution building, and I don't know yet what that's going to look like. This is the good news, I do think that we have the expertise and the creativity to try. And I think there is tremendous intellectual energy and urgency around questions of economic and social life. Plenty of people want to think seriously in community about how to make our communities more just and capable of thriving in a challenging world.
Well, thank you so much. And ending on a high note too. So I was just kidding. Yeah, so thank you so much for being with us today. It was a fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed learning more about your work in particular.
Thank you so much.